Next up on the broadcast, Katherine Robertson with the Alabama Policy Institute is back in studio with us. Katherine, it's nice to see you again.
Thanks, Don.
Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
Of course, API, the Birmingham-based conservative think tank, you weigh in and analyze a lot of legislative issues, and there's been a lot to weigh in on and analyze in recent weeks. Katherine, I'd love to begin the portion of the show by getting your take on the upheaval, if you will, in state government that we've seen over the last couple of months, especially with the felony ethics conviction of former Speaker Mike Hubbard, the ascendancy to that position by Speaker Pro Tem Victor Gaston. We also have, of course, the attempts to impeach Governor Bentley. We have the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court suspended while ethics charges are investigated. It would seem to an outsider looking in that Alabama state government is in a tumultuous state.
Well, I think they'd be right in saying that. I think we saw, leading back to early in this legislative session on to now, just what the consequences are when you don't have strong leadership in place, how things can get so turned upside down when the members of these caucuses aren't sure who to follow, and certainly it's definitely a black eye on the state, and it's very disappointing.
When we say it's a black eye on the state, that can have a lot of different repercussions. I know a lot of people have pointed to say economic recruitment, for instance, could hurt. Or suffer, rather, as a consequence of this, among many other things.
Right. One of the things that we've thought a lot about is, API, one of our missions is really to foster a more engaged and informed electorate. And, our biggest concern is that when things like this happen in leadership, that people will just become apathetic and really stop engaging and stop really paying attention to what's going on in state government because they just sort of give up on it, which is fair in some ways. But, of course, things aren't going to get better if the public disengages. And so, I think it's really important that we, stay focused on what's going on in our state and stay optimistic because things will not get better if we're not, engaged and paying attention.
I'm glad you brought that up because I had a lawmaker tell me recently that he thought that even though we've been through all of this turmoil in state government, that the public was really rooting for the legislature now to get back on its feet, to sort of right the ship, and was sort of silently cheerleading off to the side, hoping that that's what's going to be next.
I hope that's true. I mean, I'm sure it depends on who you ask. I know that, there's an attitude right now, sort of an anti-government, anti-establishment mentality nationally and here in Alabama, but it certainly is an opportunity. Every challenge can be turned into an opportunity. There is a chance to sort of right the ship. There is a chance to go back to what you ran on back in 2010 when the Republicans took over and really try to prove the critics wrong. Of course, it will remain to be seen what direction they choose to go in.
And of course, lawmakers at the same time have also been playing up the positive, saying despite all of this turmoil, let's also remember all of the good things we've done over the last couple of years.
Right, and some good things have been accomplished, no doubt. API has been a supporter of or an influencer of many of those things. School choice comes to mind. Not raising taxes comes to mind. So some good things have happened in spite of everything else going on, but I don't think that's what people are going to hold on to. I think if Republicans want to sort of save their image, they're going to have to operate really differently in the coming session until the end of this quadrennium.
At the same time, though, with Victor Gaston as the acting speaker and the possibility of another permanent speaker, perhaps at some point down the road, the tone in the House certainly changes from Mike Hubbard's philosophy to the philosophy of whoever holds that position permanently. And there's also been a lot made of how powerful the position of Speaker of the House is. It's called one of the most powerful positions in Alabama politics.
Yeah, I would say it is the most powerful position in Alabama politics. Obviously, the House being the larger of the two bodies, and then the way Alabama's governor is set up constitutionally is weaker than in a lot of other states. So I think the Speaker is a critical role for our state, but I don't think that power should be as centralized in that office as maybe it had been. I think you've heard that a lot from House members, just that over the years that position became more and more powerful and more sort of calling all the shots and maybe hearing from the rank and file a little less and allowing them to weigh in a little less. And so I think we've heard from a number of people who are considering pursuing the position that that's one thing they'd like to change.
One central theme I've heard from every lawmaker I've spoken to since the conviction of former Speaker Hubbard is that we will get through this. We are committed to turning this around and creating a new day at the State House?
Yeah, I think that's ultimately where people will end up, that we're ready to sort of pull ourselves back up and keep going. I think right now, frankly, so soon after the conviction, I think everybody that's engaged in Alabama politics, myself included, is just a little bit shocked and trying to figure out, what's going to happen next. What does this mean? What are the implications? Are there others that are going to end up being investigated too? So many questions, but I know that ultimately there are enough leaders in the House caucus to keep going and to fight, and who really believe in what they're there to do, who really did run on a principled platform, and who want to make sure they're able to go home and tell their constituents that they've been well served despite everything else that's going on. So I do think it's an opportunity. I do think there's an opportunity to turn things around, and I think you'll see hopefully some coalescing behind a strong leader with a well laid out plan for what they want to accomplish.
Katherine, almost immediately after the verdicts in the Hubbard case came in, the House Judiciary Committee convened and started work on the potential impeachment of Governor Robert Bentley. Now, this is another big bone of contention in this state, very divisive. Passions run very high on both sides of this issue. Governor Bentley recently said that he felt like this is not what the people want. He said he feels like his election to the governor's office was a mandate from the people. He feels like his constituency wants him to serve out the remainder of his term and try to live up to all the promises he made.
Well, I haven't polled the general public, but I think the fact that he was reelected has very little to do with what the public's opinion is now. For one, Governor Bentley abandoned some of his main campaign promises when he ran in 2014. He really steered away from those and did a 180 in a lot of ways. And then, of course, the general public had no idea about these audio recordings and all the implications there, the accusations by Spencer Collier and all such as that. So I don't think it's fair to say that was a mandate on what they want now. I'm not sure where the general public is on this. I think it's perfectly fair for the legislature to investigate this, to seek more information and try to see if there's anything there. If there's not, then, I'm sure they'll be the first to admit that it's not going to go any further. But I think it is their responsibility to take it seriously and just to see, again, if there is anything there.
You raise an interesting point. Even before all of the current controversy surrounding the governor arose, there was this quotient of his support of raising taxes, which is, as you mentioned, a lot of people believe he did a 180 on. And what kind of political damage did that do to him?
Well, I think as far as his trustworthiness, that was really what took a hit. I think that if you think back to when Governor Bentley was first elected, a lot of his appeal was that he kind of was an outsider. He was trustworthy. He was a doctor. He, was just somebody that would just be sort of honest and come in with a fresh perspective. And I think that image really took a hit when he started to abandon his campaign promises, and then obviously got worse from there.
Katherine, one of Governor Bentley's key legislative agenda items this year was prison reform. It did not pass. We've been talking about the possibility of a special legislative session to deal with it. The problem remains, despite the governor's prison reform package not having passed. In the 11th hour, it was amended significantly. It ultimately, as I say, didn't make it out. But this is still something I know API is still very vested in. Do you feel the electorate at large is still very invested in this?
I think the electorate has a lot of questions, as does API, as do many legislators. You and I have discussed before that there's very little debate at the beginning when the prison plan started moving. And of course, the plan is to consolidate 14 prisons into 4 with an investment of an $800 million bond issue, which really turns out to be $1.5 billion. I think it's one of the largest bond issues the state will have ever taken out. And I think the general public is obviously, probably willing to consider it, but reluctant for it to happen so swiftly. And that was really our position. We're numbers people. We like to get into the weeds and the details. That's really the service that we feel that we perform for legislators. And, we asked a lot of questions and didn't get the answers we were looking for at the time that legislators were being called upon to vote. So, little by little, we've gotten more information, been able to see more numbers, but, there's a lot of unanswered questions that, and in our minds, would need to be answered before a special session would be appropriate.
What do you think about maybe approaching the prison plan incrementally? We had Lieutenant Governor Kay Ivey on the show fairly recently, and she said she thought we ought to approach it incrementally, maybe just build a new women's prison to start with and see how that goes and move from there.
Right. Well, women's prison certainly should probably be the priority because of the poor conditions in Tutwiler. And I think there are a lot of other senators, at least, that share that view that, why do we have to just take this all at once? Let's just build one at a time. Now, you will hear arguments from the administration that it's not as cost effective to do it that way. And again, that's where you really need to see numbers broken down and really be able to see what your options are rather than just having one massive plan that's either you take it or leave it. There's no in between.
Speaking of reform, as we've talked about over your last several visits to the program, pension reform remains a key objective of API. And I know lawmakers, speaking of working incrementally, are doing so, but very incrementally, don't you think?
Yeah, pensions is one of those issues that's it's not a popular issue because it's not an issue most people understand, and it's not an issue that many people think affects them. But of course, there are two constituencies that pension reform would affect: employees, public employees, retirees, and then taxpayers. So our goal, of course, we have a $15.2 billion unfunded liability, which means we don't have enough money to cover our current cost and future cost of benefits that we've given out. And so it's Alabama's annual contribution to that plan was about $1 billion, and that number is just going to keep rising. And we feel like it's one of those things where, one thing the API is good at is looking at the long term. Politicians are elected for 4-year terms. We've been around for 27 years. So we're looking at the state's fiscal condition for the long term, and we see pensions as sort of that looming storm. So our goal would be to help the legislature adopt a pension reform plan that would protect the benefits that have been promised, but then also protect taxpayers. And as you said, it's a slow process. There's a lot of education involved. There's a lot of misinformation out there on what the legislature is trying to do. So it makes for a slow but steady process, and I think it should be. It would be a significant change for our state, and it's something that really needs to be studied.
You mentioned education. We are in the process of selecting a new state school superintendent. What are some priorities that API believes are important in that search?
Yeah, this is one of the first times we've really engaged in the search. I mean, we've been reading the applications and sort of considering, what it is that we would be looking for in a superintendent. I think, by and large, the very first thing we need is somebody that's willing to put our school children first and then the adults that are involved in the process second. I think for a long time, Alabama public education has really been beholden to the adults involved rather than putting the needs of the school children first. Obviously, somebody that's a strong character to be in charge of, that many school children. Somebody that is willing to sort of address Alabama's educational failings and not just blame that on funding. A lot of times the debate stops there. We just don't have enough money. We'd like to see somebody who's willing to work through that, work with what we have, and really propose some changes. And then lastly, I think it's really important to have a superintendent that's willing to work with our legislature. We've seen a really big disconnect there, not a lot of willingness to come to the table and consider each other's ideas and be open-minded. So that would be a really important aspect as well.
I know a lot of members of the state school board have said as much, that they considered one of the prime qualities for the future superintendent would be an ability to work with the legislature. We recently had state school board member Matthew Brown on the program, and he pointed to, as he portrayed it, a not so rosy relationship between the state school board and the legislature. And he said, how can you expect to have one when you're constantly criticizing what the legislature does? He was pointing to some criticism that apparently that the board has had for education-related legislation.
Right. I think, you've seen sort of a standoff between legislators engaged in education and people from the Department of Education and even the school board at times. So I do think that's so important because the legislature sort of portrayed as, getting in their sandbox and meddling in things without communicating, but then from the legislature standpoint, they don't always have anybody to communicate with. But I think, the main thing is we've got to be willing to stop defending the status quo, stop defending things that haven't proven to work, and to sit down together. And there are some very reform-minded legislators who I think the school board and school superintendent and department could really find, overlapping interest with if that would be more of a priority.
Catherine, I want to wrap up our conversation by talking briefly about Medicaid. It was another big elephant in the room during the regular legislative session. The challenges remain. Medicaid did end up getting a $15 million budget increase, although it asked for a $100 million increase. It's painted some somber pictures of what some of the cuts might look like if they don't find some more money. The governor has been working with them to try to prop them up as best he could, but it's not an easy answer to this, is it?
It's not. One of the points that I've brought up on the show before is that, the federal government really dictates Medicaid. Alabama has very little flexibility in ways to deliver care better, ways to make the system more cost efficient. So basically, anytime we have additional enrollees, our costs go up, and there's not much we can do about that. We can't cut eligibility, we can't change it. And so Medicaid will continue to be an issue for our state budget. It consumes 40% of our general fund right now. That number is expected to grow. Ultimately, hopefully we could see from Congress or from a president willingness to send that control back to the states, maybe in the form of block grants, so that Alabama could administer a Medicaid plan that was tailored to our state and to the needs of the people here.
Bottom line, as I've heard many lawmakers put it, we can't keep up with the astronomical growth of the program in terms of cost.
That's right, and it's a problem that many states are experiencing right now. Alabama has a very disproportionately high number of poor and people who need Medicaid. We're at about 25% of all Alabamians need the program, and our tax base has just not been able to support that. The program grows year after year, and of course the regional care organizations, which are now asking for additional funds, are designed to help control cost, but they won't necessarily cut cost in any way. It'll just try to
rein them in.
Right, cap costs for the future. So, I really think ultimately the solution would be to let Alabama run its own program. But as we continue to take more and more federal money, we lose more and more control over some of our biggest budget items.
Katherine Robertson with the Alabama Policy Institute. Always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Don.
Thanks
Likewise.
for being here. And Capital Journal. We'll be right back.